particular, was many years ago somebody asking me about a picture, and you'll see the picture later on. It's a view of what becomes Greenwoods Pond, and saying, I don't remember that view of the reservoir. And it's like, wait a minute, there's this whole history of New Hartford that is slowly vanishing from our minds. So if we look at this photograph, taken as an aerial photograph in 1934, the dark areas are water bodies. The water body on the far side is compensating reservoir, or also called Lake McDonough. And that is there, and then we have Holcomb Hill, which becomes Goose Green, running up through here, this spine of hill. Then we have this other large water body. And that large water body is Greenwoods Pond at its height. It is, although actually filling in by this point. I suspect if we had looked at it when it was first constructed, you would not have seen all of these areas of sediment infiltration. So at that point, you know, the top end of New Hartford, going into Barkhampton, is absolutely dominated by these huge water bodies. Only one of them exists today. This, however, has a much older history, a much more complex history than the compensating reservoir. So if we can go to slide next. We need to go farther back. If we went back to the 1600s, when the first white colonists were surveying the area, they marked out the area that we now know as the West Branch of the Farmington in New Hartford. And for most of this, think about the area basically from as you leave New Hartford and you head up essentially to about the dump and then the intersection to go over to Pleasant Valley. That will become Greenwoods Pond. At that point, it's marked on the first maps as something called mast swamp. Now this is actually a term that is used elsewhere. There's a mast swamp in Torrington. There are mast swamps. There is a huge mast swamp that actually survives as late as the early 20th century down in southeastern Connecticut. Mast swamps referred to areas, generally the one in Torrington, for example, is the Naugatuck, that had large pine stands intermingled. The pine stands would be on basically sandy sediment bars in the river as they widened out, intermingled with almost impenetrable swamp. They could only really be easily accessed in the winter. The reason they were called mast swamps, however, was that white pine was the most valuable resource that the colony of Connecticut was producing. Those were pine trees that were suitable for shipbuilding, and that was the most valuable thing. So the early surveyors marked out these areas and basically said, hey, here is a really good resource. Mast swamp in New Hartford is gone by the 1730s, 1740s, before the Revolutionary War. It is cut over. They cut them generally during the winter time when the ground is frozen. After that, it just simply sits as a swamp until 1816. In 1816, Michael Kellogg purchases the water rights. There were other mills, of course, operating in New Hartford, but this is the first mill that is successfully built in New Hartford on the Farmington River. Prior to that, mills were usually placed as one was already. For example, where the old Dunkin' Donuts is, there was a mill on that brook right about there. But it was relatively cheap to dam something like that small brook. Damming the Farmington River, you needed a fair bit of capital. And as you can see here, he says, erecting a dam sufficient to carry a sawmill, grist mill, etc. It very quickly becomes a machine shop. And this early newspaper clipping here talks about how they're selling shearing machines and wool spinning machines. The interesting thing with this is, if you notice that date, that is when the wool industry, the sheep industry, is still dominant in this area. You have thousands upon thousands of sheep. They outnumber the people by probably orders of 10. However, the sheep industry collapses. And in fact, it collapses about the time that in 1833, 1841, they change over to a different type of industry. The wool industry collapses, they move, that knowledge of textile making moves almost immediately over to manufacturing cotton. In the early 1800s, cotton textiles is the industry of this area of, if you go up into Berkshire County in Massachusetts. And not only did they do textiles, but they also started to make the machinery in order to create the textiles. So he's not only making the cloth, but he's also making a good business of selling the machinery to other people to make the cloth. And it works pretty well. The Greenwoods Company, however, is a totally different animal. This prior company from 1833 to 1841 is relatively small. It's basically a family business. The Greenwoods Company, although dominated by John Cotton Smith, who, by the way, you walked past the portrait of as you came into the hallway here. In fact, this is the John Cotton Smith Memorial Hall, because he would become a major personality in town. The Greenwoods Company is an incorporated company with shareholders and stock, and it runs from 1845 to 1902. The first thing they do is they improve the dam. The dam had already existed as a small log and wood dam, but they build it a little higher, they make it a little bigger, and then in 1849 what becomes called the Upper Brick Mill is built. Now this is a portion of what is still standing today. At the same time, because people like to make things complicated for historians when they come afterwards, another company is made. It's the Greenwoods Scythe Company. And the Greenwoods Scythe Company had nothing to do with the Greenwoods Company proper. They are completely separate companies. They just happen to have the name Greenwoods. And when you're researching this, by the way, it becomes even more frustrating because there's several other companies in Connecticut called Greenwoods. Trying to figure out which one's being referenced in which newspaper can be a challenge. The Greenwoods Scythe Company is now completely gone. You cannot find a trace of it. But some of you here in the room almost certainly will remember the last remains of it. The Greenwoods Scythe Company was a massive complex here on the Route 44 side of the river. It had a large building here, then another building, and a third building after that. And they made scythes for cutting hay and other material. Unfortunately, they were in direct competition with the Collins Company. And that didn't work very well. And a couple of reasons that didn't work is, first of all, the Collins Company had far more power. And we'll get into that in terms of, and what I mean by that is water power. I'll get into that. The other issue for the Greenwoods Scythe Company is they had a massive fire and in 1871, which burned most of the plant. Very little of the plant ended up being left, really just this building here. And you can see it, this is the building here. That white house, by the way, is still there. That's that last house as you leave town on Route 44, heading towards Pleasant Valley. You can see the dam here, and a section of building is still left. This was taken after the fire, when the other Greenwoods Company purchases it. Now, the Greenwoods Company that purchases it, the one on the other side of the river, is not interested in making scythes. They have absolutely no interest in that at all. They have a different reason for purchasing it. And we'll get into that. In 1953, this building here, which is the last building, is taken down, and I'll show you some more pictures. Interestingly, that building, the last building, was also probably the oldest building, certainly in terms of its structural material. If you've ever been up in Barkhamsted on any of the Barkhamsted Historical Society's wonderful tours in the center of Barkhamsted, they will mention the Barkhamsted Meeting House and what happened to its building timbers. Well, the building timbers ended up in the Greenwoods Scythe Company as structural building material. As I say, jumping past a lot of things happening. There's a lot in the Civil War that happens for the Greenwoods Company. Particularly, they get a major contract with the U.S. Army for creating the canvas for making tents, which was a useful contract to have. It's also when they get another government contract of mail bags. Now, a lot of people might think, well, what's canvas good for? Because we don't use that much canvas today. However, back in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, which is the height of the Greenwoods Company, canvas is used for everything. You use canvas for making sails. You use canvas for tents. You use canvas for covering wagons that are carrying freight. You use canvas even for making buckets. You can make buckets and then you can make a pretty decent water. Fundamentally, it's not waterproof, but it will carry water for a bit. They were often used as fire buckets because they collapsed very easily, so you could have a bucket to put out a fire. They're used for mail bags. If you take canvas and you modify it a little bit, you can create belts for running machinery with it. So there's a wide range of applications for canvas that we just don't use today. And in the 1870s and 1880s, the Greenwoods Company really takes off. This is after a brief depression in the early 1870s, this is a boom time. And it's reflected in the fact that not only are they just manufactured, they're not standing still. Because in 1879, believe it or not, and I know that date seems crazily early, they put in a line so that they can communicate with the Otis Reservoir gates to open them and close them when they need more water power way up in Otis. So they run lines up there. They have a wonderful, and unfortunately you can't read this, it was blurry anyway, but they have a wonderful telegraph machine so that they can talk from their mill on that side of the river to the offices of John Smith, which were on this side of the river. And this telegraph machine basically somehow, and I'd love to know more about how it worked, because basically what it did is each side had a dial with the alphabet on it. And you chose the dial, you chose a letter, and it sent the electrical signal across the river to the other side, and that letter came up on that dial, and so forth. So, and the wonderful thing with this was that people saw this as, and how someday everybody will have their own private telegraph in their house. Now, how many of us don't have our phone on us? So they're really thinking, and there's this idea of moving forward. They call out how sometimes their people will come up with new innovations. So Thomas Dalrymple was a blacksmith for the Greenwoods Company. He's created these shears that will cut the iron off of the cotton bales faster, which the company needed so that they could produce things a little faster. So they're constantly trying to innovate. They're adding more wheels to make more power. They're adding to their mill. And a lot of, real activity is going on in the mill itself. There is, however, a difficulty they're already running into, and the problem is power. They had started, of course, by damming the Farmington River, and that dam keeps getting raised. This will be relevant later on. It keeps getting raised in a bit, and they also have a quarter interest in the Otis Reservoir, which is way up at the top of the West Branch of the Farmington River. Now, the other 3/4 was owned by the Collins Company. Nonetheless, they have a portion of that, and so they're still running out of power. So they raise the Otis Reservoir to 40 feet. They raise the dam on the Greenwoods. Final height ends up at 28 feet, which gives them 25 feet of power for the water, the fall of the water, 25 feet. that scythe company that I mentioned, the reason they buy it is not because of the buildings, no technical interest. All they want from the scythe company is West Hill Lake, because the scythe company owned the dam on West Hill Lake. And so what they do, and that meant they controlled the water rights to West Hill. So what they do is they buy that water right, and they promptly raise the level of West Hill to its current height. So they raise it up, and that's when, if you know West Hill, that is when Loon Island vanishes underwater, because they needed more water power. They're also fundamentally, both Collins and the Greenwoods Company are very ferocious in looking for other water rights. So the Greenwoods Company buys the Rogers Rake Company in Pleasant Valley. Again, no interest in that. That's the parking lot. If you go across the Green Bridge in Pleasant Valley, that's the parking lot for the fishermen there. That used to actually be a factory, a good-sized factory, sat there. And you can actually still see some of the stone up there. What they're looking for there is to control the small, relatively small weir over the river there. So they're buying that. And Collins Company does the same thing. Eventually, they end up with a huge amount of control and a watershed. They own the water rights in a watershed of almost 200 square miles. So they're really working towards this idea of water power. The problem is, despite this wonderful newspaper article that said, you know, now that we've raised the Otis Reservoir and we've done this, we have inexhaustible water, we'll never run out of water. That was from 1866. In 1873, the mills have to shut down to half-time because they're out of water. It's a dry year. It's not this year. Let's say it was, you know, this year they'd have plenty of water. But if we go back and say 2016, 2017, when you remember how low the Farmington got, they had a real problem because they were running out of water. There was no water, there was no power, there was no production. It's a very relentless issue. So what they do is they move on to say, okay, what can we do? Water power doesn't work.
You're back.
So let's come up with some other stuff. So they go and they build a gas plant.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, I very much wish that David Kreml was still alive, because we were debating this, and he wanted to know when the gas plant was first created. Believe it or not, it's 1863. Now, the gas that we're talking about is not the liquid natural gas of today. This was gas that was made by using and burning coal. It's very grubby, by the way. And it's not very efficient, but it does work. So you burn the coal correctly and you create coal gas. And the gas was first used to light the plant, to create some power, and critically to heat the plant, to heat the mills so that they weren't having to shut down for that reason. They were kind to the town, so they said, oh, okay, well, we've got this gas plant, and boy, we've got these cool lights. We'll give you some lights too. So in 1863, by that point, as the Litchfield Examiner said in December, the church, the town hall, all stores, and most of the residences of the village are lighted by means of gas manufactured by the Greenwoods Company. That's very early in our minds, but actually gas is being used in a number of other cities throughout the eastern seaboard. Unfortunately, the Greenwoods Company wasn't out for charity, because if they had to shut down for some reason, either they weren't making enough money or there were issues, if they shut down their mills, they saw no reason to keep the gas plant running, so they would turn the lights off in town. Made for some annoyances. But that plant runs between 1863 and 1874, at which point they build the other gas plant. And this is the one that a lot of people sort of have a vague memory of, because that blew up in 1908. And it did kill the 2 workers who were doing something to a valve, is the best they could figure out. but it was rebuilt, and gas continued to be very important. This was the slide you came in on, and this postcard is taken from the bridge that was Bridge Street. So we're a little farther up the river, and what you're looking at is the bottom end of the mills. In fact, the only mill that exists today you can't actually really see. We have lower mills, we have upper mills, and we have the dam. In 1878, the Greenwoods Company owns Greenwoods Pond, all of this area the MDC now owns. It has upper and lower mills, it has tenement houses, it has a huge range of buildings and things. And if we go to the next slide, this photograph, which is taken sometime around 1880, really shows the size of the mills, because here's Greenwoods Pond, and here are all the mills. They come all the way down through here. There's all of these buildings, which is now completely open territory. The Hurley Building that we know today is this small amount of it up here. So we have today maybe a fifth of what was originally there, if that. By the way, just on a different point, I also love this picture, because it is the only picture that I know of that shows the town hall in its original configuration. That there, this building with this tower and these gables that go all the wrong ways, that's the original town hall. That burned in the 1890s and is rebuilt as today's town hall. Kind of wish it was that one still, because that clock tower is just really, really cool. And you can see here's Immaculate Conception Church. This church is just out of the frame over here. In every single sense, at this point in the 1870s and 1880s, we really have a town that is a classic southern New England mill town. The water that's being used for the mills dominates. There's raceways, there are powerways, there's this huge pond, this is a close-up. There are all of these factory buildings, and that's what it is. It's a mill town. Interestingly, as a mill town, you have some other social things going on, and I find this to be a particularly interesting newspaper clipping, because it is a dedication of the lower mill, that mill that you could see in that colored postcard. And what they say is, on Saturday evening, the 22nd, the children are to have an opportunity. This is to visit the mill and to see what they've done. The children are to have an opportunity. On Monday evening, the 24th, the French population. On Tuesday evening, the Irish. And on Wednesday evening, the American. Some things. An admittance fee of $1 will be charged Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday evenings for the purpose of establishing a reading room and library. Good music will be provided, and the room being large with a splendid floor, an enormous time is anticipated. Now, curiously, actually, this good music thing, okay, that was only for the American population. Yeah. So, whoops. But that's a very interesting, I think, newspaper article to reflect on, because everybody knew who everybody else was. And they knew if you were French or if you were Irish or you were American. And the mill was operated and employed hundreds of people who were French and who were Irish. And later on as well, a little later, you could have divided it up as the French, the Irish, the Italian, and the American. And each group was there. As I say, this was a company town. And what I mean by that, that's a phrase we usually hear down farther south, with particularly the big mining towns of Pennsylvania and the Virginia area. But company towns existed up here too, and New Hartford was a company town. The Greenwoods Company had over 700 people were directly employed. That is to say, their checks were cut by the Greenwoods Company. So their families, of course, you've got to add them in. And generally, you'd have just the one person maybe working. There were, of course, children working. They would start working for the mill, first running lunch pails for the older workers. So they bring the lunches because you weren't going out for lunch. And then they would graduate to working on various machinery. They generally ran a 10 or a 12-hour shift. This was down from earlier on when they were running up to a 14-hour shift. It owned, the company also, however, didn't just own those mills. They owned over 78 houses, in addition to tenements. They had a school that they owned and operated. The wells for those houses were owned and created by the Greenwoods Company. The gas lines that I've mentioned, those are controlled by the Greenwoods Company. They have a sawmill and an ice house, which is selling to local residents. And the ice house is the only ice house. They cut out competition elsewhere. In at least anybody else selling ice on the Farmington River in New Hartford was out of luck. So that is something they control. As I mentioned, they control Greenwoods Pond, West Hills Dam, and a vast array of other things. It's not just all that sort of control, though. This is also the dominant form of entertainment, because every year they do excursions. The mills shut down. I don't know if the lighting shuts down, by the way, but at least the mills shut down, and they go off on excursions. Now, the excursions, you could do this. I think you had to pay, even if you were an employee, but you had these excursions, and they had chartered trains. So some years they went to Coney Island, some years they went down onto to elsewhere, Hartford, they went to Southwick, they went all over the place. These were chartered trains, and the entire company would pack up for the day and go out for this excursion. They had a reading room, as mentioned. They had a fire department. One of the town's 2 temperance societies was organized by the Greenwoods Company. I'm sure that the managers thought that was probably an excellent idea, and I'm sure that they really supported that one. But they also had Christmas parades, they had dances, they had 4th of July parades. So this was really a huge, huge thing in town. It didn't last. In the 1890s, there's an interesting, and much of our information actually does come from this. You've got to love the court records. The town of New Hartford and Greenwoods Company sue each other. Basically, both of them go after each other. Town of New Hartford says, we're going to value your property at, they did a reevaluation, basically. And your property tax and your taxes are now going to be this. And the Greenwoods Company says, yeah, no, not happening. We're not that. And they start citing all of these issues. They cite the fact that even with all that innovation that's going on, these are getting to be old buildings. They're 40, 50 years old. They are not modern buildings anymore. The modern buildings are elsewhere. They cite the fact that they have to pay, they have to make that gas, even if they're making it themselves. They have to heat the buildings. They have to light the buildings. Then they go on to cite some other critical things. In particular, they cite the labor laws of Connecticut. And this is something where being progressive and humane truly came back to bite, because Connecticut and New Hartford, the whole area, was starting to put in regulation on lengths of shifts and the age that children could start work in the mills. And this was something that they felt was to their detriment. And in fact, it is then cited as the reason in 1902 why, when they get bought out, the U.S. Cotton says, you know what, your regulations and your taxes, we're done, we're out of here. We can go down south. They don't have the child labor laws. Their taxes are lower. But critically also, by that point, they don't need the water power anymore that's being produced here. There are other ways of producing the power. So U.S. Cotton shuts the mill down, and they don't give a lot of advance notice on this. 700 people are out of work in a week, immediately. In a couple of weeks, the town's population drops by over 1,000 people. The town's population will eventually drop from around 3,200 people to 1,800 people and stay there for the next few decades because everybody leaves. You know, they say, well, we can't, there's nowhere to work. With these mills shutting down, and this wasn't the only one doing it, with this mill shutting down, we have to go somewhere else. So some of them try to find work up in Massachusetts where some of the textile mills are still running. Some of them move to Tallahassee, Alabama, which is where U.S. Cotton moves the mill. Some of them go down to Pennsylvania to work in the big iron mills there that are booming at the time. In any case, they don't stay in New Hartford, the vast majority of these people. The people that run the shops as well, of course, they lose all of these customers, and things truly change overnight. In 1911, U.S. Cotton sells the mill to international cotton mills, and I will not go through what happens in the next few years too much, because it is ridiculous how many times the mortgage changes hands. It's literally like people have this hot potato, it's this old mill, the textile industry is collapsing, what do we do with it? And they keep bouncing it around. Next slide. It does, however, briefly, ever so briefly, in 1912 to 1914, it almost looks like, hey, the textiles are going to come back. Because Draycott and Terrain, which specialized in a variety of modern fabrics, they were playing around with some of the French silks and some other types of fabric that were being used. So, you know, canvas and cotton, that's on its way out. We'll switch to these other fabrics. They have really big plans, and they're not, unfortunately, they never get anywhere. It's really sad reading the newspaper articles because they'll say, well, Draycott has plans to get the mill up and running by June. And then June comes along. The newspaper says, Draycott has plans to get the mill up and running by August. August comes. The same thing happens over and over. And these insurance maps, which unfortunately aren't showing up very well, show that they are all proposed but never actually put in place. In fact, Draycott and Terrain never get their industry back off the ground. A couple of reasons for that. They have bought a hot potato. It's an old plant, difficult to work with. Unfortunately, they also get nailed by World War I showing up. And things, particularly their French backers, oddly enough, seem to be more concerned about what's going on in France than New Hartford, Connecticut. Can't imagine why. But here, they did have a couple of photographs taken, and here is a photograph of the upper mills, as it was known at that point. And you can now recognize the building we're looking at. These chimney stacks, by the way, drive me nuts because they change practically in every single photograph. I think they keep rebuilding them as they change the power. You can also see there's a railroad track here, and there's a road, and there's some buildings you can just kind of make out there. And that is an area called Upper Dublin, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So here's that top mill. There's the bottom mill. That is the lower mills. And that is basically where, if you go to, say, Cartoberfest or something, that big flat field, that's the lower mill. That's the mill that was being dedicated when you had all the different groups of people coming. And it is, or was, obviously, it's not there anymore, a classic New England multiple-story brick mill. Lots of windows for letting light in, but very difficult in some ways. In good shape at that point. And here we have the 1934 photograph that shows the extent of Greenwoods Pond. Way up here, the dump, by the way, is up here. And these are the factory buildings down through here. You can't really make it out, but here is a whole line of those 78 tenement houses the Greenwoods Company owns. But the critical thing here is all of this water. Because that led to another industry. And the Greenwoods Company diversified as much as they could. As I mentioned, they had that sawmill, they had the ice house. Well, at first they just had the ice house for, their own employees and residents in town who wanted to buy ice. Ice is, of course, rather heavy. It doesn't, really ship on the back of a wagon very well. But in the 1870s, Greenwoods Company was doing so well that they got a nice bridge built across the Farmington down at the Mobile Station, and they extended the canal line over to the company. Well, this was great for the company because now they don't have to unload their cotton bales over here at the parking lot behind Immaculate Conception and take them across the river. They can just have a train line that goes right up to the ambulance barn. You all know where that is. That's the old freight depot for the company. So they've got that. And then somebody, I'm sure, on their board said, hey, wait a minute, ice. We can make money off of ice now that we've got this railroad. Because what they do is they extend their railroad line farther up what was the Greenwoods Pond. And in fact, this is now the somewhat sometimes overgrown walking path that you can take. It is part of this railroad bed. And they can extend this railroad bed up and they can make ice on the pond during the winter, and they can ship it directly to Hartford or directly to New York City, and they can sell it. So they do build, and this, by the way, is looking from up on the hillside over here by the other railroad tracks, this huge white building here, which is about halfway up to the dump. And if you were to look across, and that is their ice house. The ice industry is large. The ice house they build is able to hold 15,000 tons. Now, they do ice in two ways, or I should say they sell ice in two ways. When they're making ice in the winter, they're shipping it directly. At the absolute height of the industry in 1909, it was estimated $2,000 of ice a day. That's in 1909 dollars. And running a 24/7 two-shift crew. Now I can only imagine being out on Greenwoods Pond in February and March in the middle of the night cutting ice. I think there are worse jobs out there, but that's got to rank right up there. And those are shifts, by the way, of 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. That's a long time to be out there cutting ice. They have 2 regular scheduled ice trains running in January, February, and March. As soon as the ice was thick enough to bear the weight of a team of horses, they started cutting. And yes, they did sort of experiment with just how thin they could take them. In fact, actually, innovation again, right? We always have some innovation here. They actually came up with a rather genius harness that they created for their horses so they could easily fish them back out of the water. I don't recommend trying it, but it did seem like it worked apparently. So they're supplying up to 100 carloads of ice each day are leaving New Hartford. That's carloads, train carloads. That's a lot of trains going out of New Hartford for 3 months carrying ice. As soon as it got too warm, however, or was starting to get warm, or maybe they couldn't get a train running, what they would do is they would store any extra ice in that massive ice house. So they would sell ice as much as they could during the winter to people who had storehouses in Hartford and New York City, and then they would start filling this ice house that sits here using the conveyor belt running up. And in a kind of useful way, they had a nice byproduct either from their sawmill or maybe the Chapin Company just down in Pine Meadow, anything that they could find sawdust from. So they packed the ice into sawdust, and then along about June, July, and August, they go back to selling ice like mad. And they sell ice. During the summer, it's packed into these sawdust-insulated cars and shipped off to Hartford and other places to be sold. Unfortunately, there's a problem with this. And when I first, you don't think about these things, right? And oh, the ice house burned. And then you're like, wait a minute, how does an ice house burn anyway? Right? It's full ice. And it burned in August of 1909, right at the height of the industry. And what happened was a rail car being pushed up to it, lit a couple of sparks, probably off of a sticking wheel, caught the sawdust on fire, because by August that ice house was essentially empty. So it was a huge cavernous space full of sawdust that was nicely drying out. August, and apparently it went up like a rather large torch. Could be seen from quite a distance. But the company that was doing it at the time, Trout Brook, said, well, you know, it's a good business, we'll rebuild. And they did rebuild. They rebuilt 2 smaller ice houses. I think they kind of figured that might be smarter. And they continue to sell ice. However, there's an issue. First of all, by the 1920s, people are really trying to figure out how to make refrigerators. The other problem is, if you think about the Farmington River, there are a couple of rivers that feed into it. One of them, and of course there are all these houses, those tenements, by the way. There's no wastewater treatment plant in town at the moment. So there's also no wastewater treatment plant in Winston. And Winston had a lot of houses and a lot of factories that neatly got rid of all of its sewage by dumping it directly into the Mad River and other brooks and things, which wasn't too bad apparently for a long time, as long as there's a lot of water flowing. But people did start to get concerned with it, particularly in drought time periods. And there was a fascinating argument by the ice company that perhaps Winston ought to stop dumping into the sewage. And the Winston selectmen basically said, well, we don't get our ice from there. It's not a problem for us. At which point the guy from Hartford said, well, maybe we ought to start selling Winston our ice and see how fast they clean their act up. They didn't get around to cleaning it up. And in fact, interestingly, the town had to use Greenwoods Pond in the 1920s as an emergency drinking water supply. And it's the first time they end up having to put chlorination in. So they start chlorinating the water at that point. Not sure how much other filtration was going on, but they at least decided that a healthy dose of chlorine might help the issue. If you look through annual reports, by the way, in the town at this time, you'll find that there are reports on, do we have any cases of cholera? Do we have any cases of this? Do we have any? It's like, wow, great, clean water. So they stopped selling ice eventually, and 1927 is the last record I have of ice being shipped. But it was a going concern right up until then. Now remember I mentioned the hot potato factories had become. Well, finally in 1917, this guy called Harry Walker from Bridgeport says, hey, I'll buy that mortgage. It's not that big a mortgage anymore. I'll buy it. But he doesn't buy it for the factories. He could care less about those factories. He buys it for the ice industry because he was known as the Ice King of Bridgeport, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful title. And that's specifically what he buys it for. Well, unfortunately, he didn't do his research very well because he did buy the mills, which meant he bought the gas plant. And he wanted to shut that gas plant down because it was costing him money. So he goes to what we now know as PURA, the utility regulation for the state, and says, hey, I want to shut this gas plant down. And town New Hartford says, yeah, no, that's gas that we're using. And in fact, it becomes a real argument. You remember a couple years ago we were having this great argument over whether electric stoves or gas stoves were better? Well, the first selectman of New Hartford at that time said, the gas stove is the better way to cook. You can't shut it down. It's better. We don't want people to have to switch over to electrics. Let us keep our gas. So Harry Walker loses his battle over gas stoves in New Hartford, and they continue. So he sells the plant. And he sells the plant to Landers, Ferry, and Clark in 1921. Now, Landers, Ferry, and Clark makes a whole raft of little engines and things for household appliances because they're just starting to come in. They make all sorts of cool things under the Universal brand, vacuum cleaners, mixers, all sorts of things. So they take the upper mill, the brick mill, and they turn it into a plant to make these little electric motors. And they take the lower mill, which is at this point starting to get a little derelict, and they turn it into what's called the box shop. Now, some of you probably have heard of the box shop, because the box shop was used for making cardboard boxes. And it was used for packing not only the ones that were made in New Hartford, all these small electric motors, but also the ones made at their main plant down in New Britain. So cardboard boxes became a major industry. And this is a picture of the Landers Ferry and Clark, some of them it's not a dated photo, unfortunately, in front of one of the big old buildings. Employed usually around 200 to 250 people. This was disappointing to the town, because when Landers Ferry and Clark moved in, they got a tax break from the town of New Hartford on the theory that they would employ 2,000 to 3,000 people. They never did employ 2,000 to 3,000 people, but they did get their tax break. So I guess somebody came out. They also said, hey, we'll rebuild that dam, and we're going to put a hydroelectric plant in. It's going to help power the area. And at that point, the gas plant finally goes off into oblivion, and I guess people had to buy electric stoves. I don't know, but probably maybe Landers Ferry and Clark was thinking, yeah, maybe we'll get into the electric stove business here too. So they rebuild some of the dam. And at this point, they take some photographs that show the structure of the dam in 1932 and 1934. It's a strange structure. In fact, it has holes in the top of it. And there is a terrifying story of a small boy who was playing, and he got, his other people saw this happen. He vanished, and they assumed, as a number, the body count is very high, I won't go into it, they assumed, as a number of other people had, that he drowned in the undertow at the bottom of the dam, and his body was swept downriver, because they dragged the river, but they couldn't find him. 2 days later, some workmen were working on repairing some holes in this wooden structure that you see on the top of the dam, and they heard a voice. The boy was still alive. He had spent 2 days in the structure, the wooden structure at the top of the dam, and miraculously he survived being caught in the dam itself. But that does tell you that the dam was a structure that had issues. Unfortunately, in 1936, March 18th at about 8:02, according to the factory whistles, the dam said, I've had it, I'm done. And it failed due to ice buildup. Of course, nobody was cutting that ice anymore. I don't know if that played into it or not, but anyway, it failed due to ice buildup. And you can see this picture is taken actually during the flood itself. You can see here that the dam is mostly earth, and this is the original structure of the dam right here. Kind of, that dark, rubbly looking rock, and it really is rubbly rock. It is not well set. It's just basically fieldstone rock. And this is the cut rock that gradually built it up to its height of 28 feet. The entire dam failed in a matter of seconds. Onlookers said you could just see it open up like a book was being opened. It just split right down the center and was gone, and went downstream.
What year was that?
1936, in March. It's an interesting flood because, of course, it's a spring flood, which the Farmington was known for. A number of really, really devastating ice floods in the spring. And it takes out quite a number of buildings as it goes downriver. You can see here again the pile of rubble. Next slide. And a little bit of that wooden superstructure still left. Here is the old scythe shop. This house there you can see. Next slide. What's left behind is a mud flat. That river had, obviously it's been taking all of Winston's sewage, so it's a shallow, warm-bodied pond. It was great for sailing on, and it was great for certain types of fishing, but it certainly didn't smell good after that flood. Now, interestingly, we go to the Next couple of slides, you can see here, this is Pine Meadow, and about 100 people were left, without homes. You could just make out a huge block of ice here, is what's taken that barn down, and it took out Bridge Street, which is rebuilt in the same spot. Doesn't last very long. That'll go out again in 1955. It takes out the Black Bridge, the covered bridge that was Black Bridge in Pine Meadow, and it also takes out the Satan's Kingdom covered bridge as well, and that is then built as a steel bridge for the first time. So, hugely destructive flood for New Hartford. Curiously, the newspapers all said that you could actually see the original dam from the Michael Kellogg Dam was visible afterwards. And the title reference for the Kellogg Dam says it's about 80 yards upstream of the bigger dam. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Let me go measure this out. So I measured it out, and certain things really don't change, because if you measure up from the old dam, the dam that we're accustomed to, which is down here, if you measure up 80 rods, you hit the tip of this island. And it's almost certain that that change in the river's course there is, I guess you could say, a shadow that is left behind by the original 1813, 1816 dam of Michael Kellogg, still shaping the riverbed even to this day. So, okay, the dam's gone. The first thing everybody thought was, well, we're going to rebuild it. And the problem is, of course, that Landers, Ferry, and Clark ended up in a rather ugly lawsuit with the town of New Hartford and a couple of other people, and they were no longer the big player. The big player on the Farmington River is the MDC, Hartford Water Works Company as it was known then, but now is the MDC. So the state of Connecticut says, well, gee, we'll settle this lawsuit, and what they decide is they settle it out of court, and the way it's settled is that Landers, Ferry, and Clark will sell all the water rights and the Greenwood Pond to the Hartford Water Works, now the MDC, which is how Landers, Ferry, and Clark ends up, just how the MDC ends up with Greenwood's Pond. Notably, I'm leaving out the town of New Hartford in that settlement, because the town of New Hartford doesn't get anything, really. The MDC gets it, because this is how things worked. So there's this debate. Do we rebuild this dam? Well, the water company that now owns the water rights has no interest in rebuilding it. The town of New Hartford would sort of like that hydroelectric plant back, and some people would kind of like to go fishing. And the debate rages on and off until the 1960s, at which point flood control, the U.S. Army Corps comes in and says, actually, no, now we're the big players, and we say that, no, you can't build that dam there because it's not something that we want to have on the river. And that ends the debate. But the other part of the debate that has been raging and gives both support for and against the Army Corps and the MDC is about fish. Now, people growing up around Greenwoods Pond, when it was Greenwoods Pond, went fishing there all the time. They generally went fishing literally for supper, because what they were catching was this guy, big catfish. The Greenwoods Pond was known for massive catfish. It was known for big eels. It was known for all of your nice, sun-loving, warm water-loving, slow water fish that were easy to catch by the strings. But, that went out in the 1930s, and by the 1960s, when the debates finalized, another group of fishermen were happily using the area, and they were the trout fishermen. Now, trout does not like warm, still water. Trout likes warm, cold water. And trout was also something that the federal government and the state government were pushing extremely hard to restore the rivers for the trout fishermen. Sort of like that divide that we saw with, the Irish and the French and the Americans. This is the similar sort of divide. On one hand, you have the people who grew up fishing for their supper, and on the other hand, you have the trout fishermen. Now, no fault of the trout fishermen. My great-grandparents were trout fishermen. They loved trout fishing. They had their trout pond. But to be quite honest, it was a different socio-economic class of people in New Hartford. So you had two sides pitted against each other. The trout won out. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, who knows. At the same time, the plant itself is shrinking. The lower mill is taken down after severe damage in flooding during the 40s and 50s, and the upper plant starts to shrink. This example is a storage building that's taken in 1946. This building has no windows left in it. This is now the lower parking lot. You can see it has no windows. There's vegetation growing up around it. You can see there are missing windows in this section of the upper plant. A lot of the plant is essentially no longer in use by this time. Next slide. And that's things that people, I think in town in the 1940s and 50s must have been very difficult for people, because the people growing up around it would have remembered it when it looked like this. Here's 44 coming into town, past the Greenwoods Pond. Here's the bridge over the dam, the big factories, and Lower and Upper Dublin. This is Lower Dublin, the set of tenements now, which are buried in the woods if you walk up the river. And Upper Dublin is above it, and you can actually still see the foundations of most of these houses. There's one of these row houses still exists. They would have remembered that as these tenements. They weren't great housing. They had outdoor privies going into the Greenwoods Pond, but they were good places to live. Next slide. Not so much by 1946. These are photographs taken by the MDC when they were purchasing the property, and you can see that these are really starting to be very, very derelict buildings. And they are taken down by the 1950s. Each year, basically, the MDC takes one more down. They were renting them out right to the end, but they are no longer places of good buildings. Next slide. And the old scythe shop finally suffers the same fate. The building that had started out its life as the timbers from the Barkhamsted Meeting House so many, many years ago. This is Route 44 right here. Okay, as you left town, going towards the dump this way. And here it is. There's some children playing, and if one could zoom in on those photos, you'd see that those children are actually barefoot, and they're looking at the photographer. It's a great photo actually, because they're looking at the photographer with a huge amount of suspicion. And when I saw that, I was like, you see those pictures, but you never think that that's your town, New Hartford, to realize that, this sort of change was just as traumatic in New Hartford as it was elsewhere. Next slide. And in 1953, it's finally dismantled, and unfortunately, our counselor was asking me about this. Unfortunately, I have no idea where those timbers went. They were taken down for salvage, but they probably ended up simply getting scrapped. And that finally vanishes. It does say that it had outdoor privies, by the way, still as late as 1948. So, yeah. Next slide. The mill, however, oddly, surprisingly, you'd think, actually gains a new life. Landers, Ferry, and Clark may have been a disappointment for the town, but Underwood was not. Underwood buys it from the mill, but not the water rights. Water rights go to the MDC, so they split. Underwood Typewriter buys it in 1943. And the first thing they do is they start making guns for the U.S. Army, because it's the middle of World War II. And the plant is immediately turned over to war footing and does that. But then they go back to making typewriters. Like the Greenwoods Company generations before, this is not just a place to work, it's a life. You have the Duckpin League, you have Friday night dances, it's a union shop of the local 1381, you have Christmas parades again, you have 4th of July parades again, and it ends up employing about 450 people. They have an open house This time everybody's welcome, and you can come. They say this is your chance to see factory work at its best. We believe our working conditions and pay are superior. We hope that you will come and see for yourself. They aggressively advertise for employers. In fact, they're really begging for employment in the 1940s and 50s as they get the plant up and running. They have bowling.
What did I do?
Hang on. Next slide. There you go. Okay. A fascinating newspaper article I hit, though, was this one here. Parts of a unique machine made in New Hartford. And what it was the first typewriter that used the simplified Korean alphabet. Was made here in New Hartford. So we, of course, typewriters, right? That they type in our alphabet. This is the first one made for the Korean alphabet in the 1950s. And it was made here, parts of it were made here in New Hartford and assembled partially here and partially in Hartford. So this idea, of brand new things, and they really work. There's this idea of, one person who lived here in New Hartford, she's mentioned in the company newsletter as having figured out how to save a little bit of space in the carrying case. So, making the carrying case a little more efficient, and how she's working on the factory floor, but she's figured this out, and they takes it to the engineers at Underwood, and Underwood runs with it and puts it in production. So, I think it was a factory that was really doing quite well. However, they found that working elsewhere made sense, so they moved. Next. And briefly is owned by the Perry family in 1960-63. Originally, the idea here had been partially the Beaver tractor. Now, that had a main plant down in Stratford, Connecticut, but it never really goes very far here. They did make some airplane parts and some tractor parts, but it wasn't quite the right fit. Finally, we get around to the modern world, and the Hurley family buys it in that point, and the Hurley manufacturing moves in to 1963. They were invited to town by Hugh B. Callahan, first selectman, after a fire in their factory plant in Collinsville, and the Greenwoods plant was a good fit. They made springs, and I don't want to go into too much detail, if only because the expert is sitting in the room. But so you can ask him. However, I think the fascinating thing with this is the range of parts. We don't really think about springs that much, right? But everything: computers, gun parts, airplanes, batteries, and particularly, I think one of the things that I think is often overlooked, but probably one of the most important ones, is actually in the medical industry. So all of these different springs, custom springs, you name it, it could be sort of figured out and created. And that runs for a long time. But they also start saying, well, this is a big factory, we don't need all of the space. And I should say that, Hurley Specialties is still making certain types of, not springs, but certain types of small metal parts. When I say small, this picture here taken from their website shows a coin with the parts around it. So that's your size of a specialty part that is still made there. But it is being used for other companies as well. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but the Lampel lights, they made interesting flashlights and light bulbs. So that was made there. And a number of other small industries. Hurley was usually employing, the 30s to 50 range of number of employees. So they weren't using the entire mill. So they were renting it out. And one of the other companies that they rented it out to, of course, is the one that so many of us know, which was, of course, Ovation Instruments. Now, Ovation Instruments, much like Hurley, much like the Perry Industries, they're all connected to each other. Perry and Hurley and Ovation are all coming in and out of the aerospace industry. And in Connecticut, we do actually have what's called Aerospace Alley, which was Pratt & Whitney and Sikorsky. Perry Industries is still involved in it. Just up the road, Sterling, which has now been sold, and I forget its new name, Sterling Engineering, making parts for the aerospace industry. And Ovation is part of that. Ovation comes out of the Kamen Aerospace Corporation, whose founder, Charles Kamen, also really liked guitars. And he realized that a couple of things. First of all, the laminate products they were playing with the aerospace industry could be formed to make really nice guitars, but there was also an electrical expertise that played into it. So he started to take this hobby of his and he turned it into a going concern, because the market for guitars in the 1960s and 70s was around $200 million. It's not an insignificant market to play with. And Ovation makes a name for itself, making the first really good electric guitars. They have the fortune to pick up Glenn Campbell and his television show, and Glenn Campbell is using an Ovation guitar, so there's a huge draw from that side. But it's not just the folk country side. They also end up picking up, among others, over time, they picked up people like Mick Jagger, Bon Jovi, some other people that I don't recognize because I have no idea of the music industry, but that's okay. They were out there, and they made these guitars. Here you can see right into the 2000s. I love the design of this guitar, by the way. It is so late 1990s. I mean, it's just wonderful. You know, great early pixelization going on there. Next slide. Of course, it wasn't just guitars they were making. Because they were making electric guitars, they also end up making the sound systems that go with the guitars. So you could buy the whole thing. You could buy, for $619, you could buy the bass tube, you know, the amplifiers, the sound systems, then buy the guitar to go with it, whole thing you could get. They also even, you know, if you needed the strings, everything. So really, really very interesting industry. And that obviously took us up to the 2000s, but I'd like to really point out that we will be doing a similar presentation with some slightly different things to it, but when we open an exhibit, we're hoping probably late summer, we're not sure yet, we have to figure out the timing, over at the Hurley Business Park, because if you haven't been there, you need to go there. I had to count it up, by the way. Apparently, I'm not sure I got it right, you can correct me. It looks like you have about 35 small businesses by now. Okay, is that about right? Yeah. I was like, I kept counting. I'm like, man, there's a lot of people over there, you know? And it's some really cool businesses making, much like it always has for 200 years, some really new and innovative things. It may be down to a small bit of the buildings, but I think in terms of innovation, the Hurley Business Park continues. So that's where I'll end. I'll take questions, if you would.
Just curiously, you mentioned water quality.
Yep.
When did electricity come in? And I saw one of the older pictures. I saw a telephone pole. I don't know if that was a telegraph or
electricity. They're playing around with the hydroelectric as early as early 1910s as to how to figure out how to make that work. So that photograph, though, was taken in the 1940s. Well, the earliest photo you saw was the telegraph lines. Those are 1870s. But no, electricity, you know, that hydroelectric plant is, you know, cutting edge when it's put in by electricity. Yes, in multiple ways. Yeah.
One of the things that my father always talked about was how beautiful the Greenwoods Lake was.
Yes.
And it was used for everyone in the town for recreation and walking and love songs and, you know, just gorgeous things. And there was the Greenwoods Inn that was very popular to eat at. And in fact, I think we had some of the silverware GI on it with So it was really part of the village identity with this beautiful lake and,
Yes.
much like a resort town.
Yeah. I kind of skipped over that because I knew this was going to be a long presentation. But the recreation aspect of that pond was, and that's one of the reasons why the town fights for so long to get it rebuilt. That's almost 30 years they're fighting with the state of Connecticut to try to rebuild that. And of course, that's also why they end up settling partly for Brown's Corner because of the recreation aspect. They really, people had a lot of fun on that lake. Yeah. Yes.
Either the flood as a consequence of or the 55 flood, did either of those have an impact on the tenant housing or on the property?
Well, on the tenement housing, oddly enough, no, because of course they were going upstream on the lake, and so when the dam failed, they were fine. The 1936 flood did take out some of the buildings that were already not being used. As the mill shrinks, it shrinks back away from the river, and I think that's partially due to the flooding. So 36 takes out some. Then 1938 hurricanes take out a little more, and Landish Ferry and Clark lets them go. They don't repair things that get damaged at that point. 55, in the aerial photos of 1951, the vast majority of the things by the river are already gone. The lower mill is still there partially. And so I think it's after the 1955 flood that is completely taken out, finally, and gotten rid of. So the floods do have damage. It's one of those difficult things because buildings may not have been insured partially, and then they're already not really using them in their entirety. So why rebuild them eventually? So they do get taken out over time. It's not like Winston where the flood comes in and changes everything overnight. The change in New Hartford takes a generation, basically.
So you said at one point that the population dropped around 1902 all the way down to about 1,800 people.
Yep.
Is that what you said? By the 1950s, did the population keep
Yes.
growing?
Yes.
Did it grow because people were working here, or did it grow because we were becoming more of a bedroom than we were just working? I wonder how hard.
Both. Yeah, thank you. It does take until the 1940s to start growing. It's partially simply due to the sheer demographics of the country. We're entering the baby boom. But it's certainly every time these companies come in, and it's one of the reasons why Hubie Callahan invites Hurley to come in, and really, I think tries to make a good deal for them and tries to help them out. It's why they gave the tax break to Landish Ferry and Clark. They're hoping that they'll bring in more employees and hoping they'll move people into town. And they do. Certainly people for Ovation, when Ovation moves here from Bloomfield, the people working for Ovation, many of them move to New Hartford. So that does play into it, yes.
In the early days when the cotton mills are early 1800s, where's the cotton grown?
Down south.
Yes.
Yes. First, up until the 1870s, it's shipped up to Hartford by boat. As soon as one of the reasons there's a real push for the railroad lines here is to get to that mill, and when the railroads start to expand, there are fights, and I mean literal fights, over which town is going to get the railroad, because if you got the railroad, your mill survived. If you didn't get the railroad, your mill did not survive. And in fact, actually I was up in Colebrook last week talking about their mills up there, and Colebrook River, which is now under the flood control, did not survive. Part of why that textile mill did not survive is Colebrook didn't get the railroad. Winsted got it, New Hartford got it, Pleasant Valley didn't get it. And Pleasant Valley and Riverton really struggled. So it's by railroad from then on.
I think that we talked a little bit last week. My father in the 90s did quite an extensive review of trying to put the dam back in for recreation, but also with the idea of hydropower.
Yes.
And, you know, at that point, economically, it wasn't something that made sense, and hopefully sometime in the future it could make sense, because that land, you said, is still owned by the NDC and not built on and not used for anything.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up. The hydroelectric, argument that was being made by in the 1930s, the economics worked. In the 1960s, you've got the oil boom, and hydroelectric power is very much out of favor. So again, it's another nail in the coffin, so to speak, for the dam, because the numbers aren't there.
Was there a lot of competition between the factories or the various mills and stuff in downtown here versus the ones in Potown?
Well, yes. I skipped an entire bit of Hartford's history here, because this wasn't the only textile mill.
That was mostly ironworks down there.
It's more, well, there's several things. You've got the Greenwoods mill. Then you have D.B. Smith Company, because there's a falling out in the Smith family, and Darius B. Smith does not get on with his brother John Cotton Smith, and so Darius builds his textile mills. They were about where Pine Meadow School is today. Nothing remains of them. We know very, very little about that company. It employed about 200 people. Then you had the Chapin Company. They made wooden tools, carpenter's tools. Then, until the 1860s, you had the ironworks in Puddletown. So the only two that are in direct competition are D.B. Smith and Greenwoods. What they are all fighting over, however, is water. And that's where the fight comes in.
I've always wondered, where did the Smith family get the money to start these mills and do all this stuff? Do they?
Stock,
information
it's
on
shareholder.
that? Stock.
They're stock. Yeah. They are true corporations in that sense. So they have bondholders, and
So were the Smiths like founding families of New Hartford, or did they come from somewhere else?
They're-
Specifically to start mills? Or?
yeah, they came specifically to start the mills. Yeah. They're like the Kellogg's and the Chapins that way. They're all looking at the Farmington River as a good place to build mills, because it's a fast running river with a lot of water power.
Just a quick comment on the Smiths. The Smith family is a very big family in Hartford. And in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they were a fairly powerful mercantile family with a number of brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, and what have you.
Yep.
And a surprising number of companies which were founded by one Smith or another, or partly, are still in operation in Hartford. Sometimes a little hard to trace.
Yeah. So it's like many of these families. Yeah, they're able to leverage their family connections when these corporations are set up. Any other questions?
Well, we hear so much about Hitchcock Factory.
Yes.
Chairs,
Mhm.
Hitchcock.
Yeah.
Was there anything like that? I know the Chapins did things like
The Chapins
like
probably
ruler-
made the
rulers
tools that the
and things
Hitchcocks
like that.
used. Yeah.
Was there anything like furniture making?
No, Hitchcock really does control that. They dominate that. Yeah. No, I mean, yes. Let me rephrase that. Actually, there are some, but they don't get to be big. The only one that gets any size at all is a company that, believe it or not, and I wouldn't have thought there was an industry for this, Henderson out in Neepaw, which makes casters for bed frames. Talk about a specialty industry. That's what they did, is casters for your bed, so you can roll your bed around.
None of the shoe factories open here though on the river.
No, we don't get any of those. We have brush factories. They make brushes for shoes, but no shoe factories.
Yeah, I just wondered
Yeah.
because Rhode Island and New York and Atlanta.
They have the, yeah.
And we have the weaving, but no felting.
The felting seems to be something that D.B. Smith specialized in. Yeah. Yeah, as I said, the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets.
So there was a big clock industry in Winstead,
Mhm.
right? It's a big town.
Thomaston, yeah.
Right. Was there any clock industry
A
here?
couple of little clocks over in Neepaw. Actually, no, there was one in North Village that made clocks. Little personal industry. It was, I think, it was just like one person. And same over in Neepaw.
So if I go antiquing, I'm not looking for New York.
You could find it in Hartford Clock, actually.
But
The Historical Society, if you're welcome, by the way, the Historical Society, we're open first Wednesdays and third Saturdays
Yep.
from 2 to 4. And we do have 2 clocks that were made in New Hartford. So if you want to see a New Hartford made clock, you need to come visit us. Because we got them.
And if anyone's interested, we do have office hours that we can set up. That if the email that's on the invite that you all receive, there's an email. That's my email on the bottom. Just reach out to me. I'd be happy to set up time to have you come. Can't be
And that is Chris Sippel, our president.
Yes, yes, sorry.
So I can't help you just because we had verdict orchards, right? And I was told that the verdicts, before they were able to buy the orchard, were working in a broom shop in New Hartford.
Bancroft Brooms.
That's what it was?
Yep. And I haven't actually figured out exactly where it was. I've got 2 possible locations for it. So either one of the 2 photos is misidentified.
So
But
it had
yes,
nothing to do
Bancroft.
with Hurley Building.
No, it's that's I think that's in Pine Meadow, but it could also be around where the Dunkin' Donuts used to be. So as I say, I'm working on that one. Yeah.
Larry's also.
Okay. Could have been that one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.